When the zombie apocalypse came, the lives of thousands of people changed. After all, the dead surrounded people and were encountered at every step. Each meeting with them could be the last. Therefore, a person needs to be ready. Mutants were extremely hardy and strong and could easily catch up with and knock an adult to the ground. The main character was an experienced soldier in the past, so he prepared to meet monsters. His task was to find supplies for his family and survive for their sake. He had to risk his own life, which he did every day. The streets were teeming with mutants, so he used a car he found on the street. But even that was not safe, because the monsters had intelligence and could pursue their prey. He had special equipment that was critical for his survival on the city streets. The man had to wear special armor and equipment that helped and protected him. There were so many zombies on the city streets that any walk for supplies could be the last. He had to break through because that was the only way to escape from the environment. There were really many of them. It was real hell. A person who was not ready would die immediately after the first encounter with a zombie. His car was very badly damaged. The windshield was broken. Stopping in a crowd of mutants meant death. Suddenly, the broken glass could not stand it, and one of the zombies tried to get into his car. The man did not want to die like that, so he started pressing the gas pedal with all his might. For him, it was ordinary everyday life. Such things happened to him all the time, and every day he had to risk his life. But now, he understood that the danger was real. After all, the zombies had overturned the car and locked him inside. The car became a living grave for him, and gradually the zombies began to surround him and climb inside. He couldn't die because it meant the death of his loved ones. He had to do everything possible to survive. It was scary, he screamed. But even a few months ago, he had no idea what awaited him and his family. He had a wife and daughter, and they lived their normal lives like all other people. But everything changed the day when people in military uniforms appeared on the streets of the city. It was announced over a loudspeaker that martial law had been imposed in the city to try to stop a new, dangerous epidemic that posed a serious threat to all of humanity. People had to follow the main news channels to learn about the spread of the infection and possible risks. The main character's wife was very worried about the epidemic because their daughter was still very young. To calm his family, the man promised to do everything possible to change the situation and ease their situation. Even in this difficult time, he tried to joke. The news reports reported that the number of infected people had already increased to several thousand people. From that day on, quarantine was introduced because politicians believed that this was the only way to slow down the spread of the disease. Rumors spread on the internet that it was a zombie virus, and over time, those infected allegedly turned into monsters. However, the professor did not support this idea and categorically rejected such statements. The man also did not believe in turning people into zombies, considering it only a way to scare the population and keep them at home. The main goal now was to earn money and stock up on everything necessary for the quarantine period. That morning, doctors went around the house, conducting a census and identifying the sick. From now on, they were supposed to bring food to all living people every few days, and in case of need, they could be contacted for help. There were almost no people on the streets because everyone tried to avoid danger and stayed at home. For the first time in many years, the main character allowed himself to sleep longer, because now he did not have to get up early and go to work. The supplies that the doctors brought could provide them with food for several weeks, so they did not have to worry about money. The daughter wanted to go out into the yard and play, but the father explained to her that it was too dangerous. They could not take the risk. To distract her, he turned on the TV, which reported that no new cases of infection had been detected in the last 24 hours. This meant that the epidemic had been stopped, and this news brought great joy to the people. The last days in the apartment had been extremely difficult, but suddenly the light went out. After checking the meter, the man realized that something serious had happened. The neighbors also had their electricity cut off, and now they didn't know what to do without it. On the streets, the police tried to calm the angry crowd, assuring them that the outages were temporary and that everything would be restored soon. Hearing this, people began to go outside, because there was no point in staying in their apartments anymore. The police tried to stop them, but in vain. Everyone was convinced that the epidemic was over and the danger had passed. Suddenly, a column of smoke rose a few blocks from their house. It seemed that the fire was huge, and it was difficult to understand what was really happening. To hold people back, the police were already ready to use weapons. But suddenly explosions were heard, and shooting began a few meters away. The sounds became louder and louder. It felt like they were getting closer. It was unclear from which side to expect danger, and the man, trying to protect his family, quickly led everyone back into the apartment. Suddenly, a stranger appeared on the street, running away from someone in panic. A huge crowd of zombies was chasing him, and seeing this, people, along with the police, rushed to flee. But they could not escape. The monsters were too fast and did not know fatigue at all. They caught up with the defenseless and tore them to pieces. Despite the desperate shooting of the police, there were too many monsters, and the bullets did almost no harm. Surrounded by a crowd, everyone was doomed, with no chance of survival. The zombies tore their bodies apart, causing people unbearable pain and torment. Then they began to penetrate the houses, destroying innocent residents on their way. Panic broke out in the city. Civilians found themselves in a death trap, unable to leave their own apartments. The man understood that danger was approaching. Now he had to do everything possible to save his family. His daughter cried in horror. She was extremely scared. They moved away from the balcony. The father quickly began to close all the windows and doors, trying to block any way into the apartment. So that his daughter would not hear the screams of people and the sounds of shooting outside, he put headphones on her. The man tried to convince her that this was all just a game and that what was happening was not real. Only after his words did the girl calm down a little and believe that her father was telling the truth. Then he rushed to the door to make sure that it was locked. But strange sounds were coming from the corridor. It became clear the monsters were already very close, and now their family was in the same danger as everyone else. There were so many of them that they could easily break down the door and get into the apartment. And at that very moment, the monsters began to bang on the front door. The man was seized with panic. If they broke inside, it would be impossible to stop them. He grabbed the phone, hoping to call for help because this was his only chance to escape. But instead of an answer, he heard a message. During quarantine, calls are prohibited, and if you need help, you should contact another time. In despair, he cried. At that moment, the man realized that they had been deceived all this time. In fact, the situation was much worse than they said, and there were many more infected people. Despite this, he had no right to give up because the life of his family depended on him. Soon, the water was also turned off, and the people found themselves in an even more difficult situation. The main character began to check all the taps, hoping that at least one would be able to get some water. But all his efforts were in vain. Then he hurriedly began to collect the necessary supplies. It seemed that he had a new plan. He decided to use an empty bucket. He began to tightly cover the empty buckets to preserve even the remnants of water that were still inside. This was vital because most likely the water supply would never be restored. Despite everything, he continued to make attempts to call for help, although he understood that he would not get an answer. His wife cried. She had already come to terms with the fact that their family was doomed. Her husband promised her that they would survive, and he would do everything to make it possible. She seemed to believe his words because she simply had no other choice. None of them could have imagined that events would unfold so terribly. They did not even suspect how critical the situation was. It was clear they would have to stay at home for a long time, and the lack of water and food would turn into a real threat to their survival. Therefore, it was necessary to accurately count the remaining provisions and learn to distribute them economically. Fortunately, the last time they managed to buy a large amount of baby cereal, this supply was enough for a long time. Also in the pantry were a few kilos of rice, beans, corn, 2 packs of pasta, and some fast food. There were some vegetables, a few packages of yogurt and rice cakes in the fridge. They even opened the fridge door to collect some water from the condensation. After all, the water reserves were melting, and soon they could disappear completely. First of all, it was necessary to eat those products that spoil quickly and put the rest aside for later. But it was almost impossible to cook food without water. Now they had to figure out how to cook dishes because they could not eat raw rice. And suddenly the man remembered that they still had a reserve. 40 liters of water. It was stored inside the water heater and it could be used. It was enough to open the valve to get the much-needed vital water. After counting, they realized that they actually had about 50 liters of water, which meant that now they would be able to cook real rice. This news gave them joy and, most importantly, hope. They felt how much they loved each other and how grateful they were for their support and presence. But outside the walls of their apartment, everything remained the same horror. Soulless zombies continued to roam the streets. From time to time, screams could be heard from people who risked their lives trying to leave their homes in search of food and supplies. The only desire of each of them was to survive and at least someday return to normal life. They followed one another, and some, out of desperation, dared to take a step to leave their own apartment in search of salvation. Parents did this for the sake of their children, but almost no one could make their way through the crowds of the dead. At that moment, a brave man died. He fell dead right in front of his little son. Most of all, he wanted only one thing, for his child to survive, even if he himself was not destined to. For the boy, this was the end. He was left without support and his closest friend. Time passed and nothing around him changed. In the end, his father's body also fell prey to the infection. And the child, trembling with fear and shedding tears, only watched and prayed that it would turn out to be a terrible dream. But in front of him stood no longer his father, but a soulless creature, in which there was no heart or emotions left. He did not even feel pain. When someone threw a bottle at him, he did not even react. Seeing this, the boy was not only scared, but also felt sorry. Because in front of him was his own father, whom he had already lost forever. Some male neighbors, not realizing the tragedy, tried to perceive everything as fun. They laughed and threw things at the dead, not even thinking that they were once also living people. The poor boy tried to stop them because he couldn't believe that his father was not real. He felt pain and tried to protect him. Because of his scream, the neighbor missed and wasted a valuable bottle, which made him very angry. The boy felt very sorry for his father and asked him not to touch the man with the briefcase. Other people mocked him, claiming that his father was a psychopath or a coward for leaving him alone in the apartment. These words deeply affected the boy and he started crying. There was no more food left in them, and his father had eaten almost nothing in recent days, so the boy decided to go in search of supplies. Despite the complexity of the situation, no one wanted to share food with him. People ignored the poor boy and continued their business. Without hesitation, the men threw bottles at the monsters, getting great pleasure from it. They had fun watching how those bottles hit the heads and the zombies began to get angry. The zombies noticed that the bottles were flying in their direction and were looking for a way to get to the people in the apartment. Then the people stopped and came up with another plan. They lowered a rope and tried to throw it over the head of one of the zombies. After that, they began to pull him. This brought them so much pleasure that they did not even think about the consequences. After all, when they were left without electricity and were forced to sit at home, this was the only way to have fun. It was very interesting to watch the creatures that could not reach them. However, now the zombies have become much more aggressive. They began to create a pyramid, climbing on each other to get to the people. Very soon, they began to climb the walls of the house, and only now, the people realized how much they were wrong. However, now it was too late to change anything. The zombies began to break the metal bars. Because there were too many of them, they quickly managed to do it. Now the people were trapped, surrounded by monsters on all sides. They had no chance to save themselves because the mutants got inside their house. All the people watched what was happening, but no one felt sorry for them because they themselves were to blame for what had happened. Now it became clear that the metal bars were not a reliable protection against monsters. The man tried to collect the remains of water. He did this so that his daughter could drink. They were ready to do everything for their little girl and gave her all the water without even drinking a drop. When they watched their daughter drink for the first time in several days, then they realized that they were truly happy. In addition, the father came up with another way to cheer up the child. He managed to turn off the phone, and now she could enjoy her favorite game. And together they played it, and even such moments were very valuable and happy. The man invented a special generator with which he managed to charge the phone. However, for this it was necessary to turn the handle for a long time, but it was not a big problem. The phone charged very quickly and they could use it. They also constantly watched their daughter sleep and hoped that the next morning she would wake up. They had not drunk water for a long time, but none of them wanted to do it. Their lips were dry and they looked very bad because they had not drunk water, but none of them wanted to do it. But they understood that this could not continue or be permanent, and sooner or later, they would have to drink some water. Therefore, they agreed to do this right now, so as not to expose their own bodies to danger. They each drank a glass of water. Immediately, they felt much better, because it was their first sip in several days. Now water had a completely different meaning for them. Never before had they thought that it was such a precious resource. The woman began to feel sad again, because sooner or later their supplies would run out and they would have to leave their own home for the sake of survival. However, she quickly calmed down. She did not want her husband to see her in such a state. The husband smiled. He was glad that even in such a situation, his wife was not upset. They tried to joke because it was the only way they could console themselves. Suddenly, the people heard a strange sound. It was coming from the balcony, so they had to check what really happened. Carefully opening the window, they saw a strange note lying in the middle of the balcony. The man carefully approached it and picked up the piece of paper. It was a note from their neighbor who lives opposite them. His child had a fever and needed to find medicine, so he tried to ask other people who were not indifferent. The man could not refuse him because I believe he really needed help. Now they had to come up with a way to give him the medicine. For this, he was going to use a rope because throwing them was very risky. He tied one end of the rope to the box, and the other he wanted to hold in his hands in case of need to pull it. And when everything was ready, he threw it. First, they needed to try to connect the rope between their own dwellings. Everything worked out, and they managed to connect the rope between their own dwellings. Now they could tie the medicines and safely pass them to each other. That's exactly what they did after a while. The man had all the medicines he needed. He wanted to thank people for their help, so in return, he sent them a package. It was water, which was critically needed for survival. He sent a note with it thanking the people for their help. Everyone was happy because it was a very profitable exchange. Very quickly, some people also started using ropes to exchange some necessities, but food and water were not enough for everyone and hard times began. The man had not drunk water since then and continued to endure despite the fact that he was very sick. He needed to find a way to get more water. He turned his attention to an air conditioner that could contain condensate and hoped that this would help him. He needed to make the motor inside the device roll manually, with which he could get the precious person. So he started to disassemble the air conditioner. He was so sick that he couldn't concentrate and focus his attention. However, he knew very well what he needed to do and tried to find the compressor. Unfortunately, it was sealed and it wasn't as easy to get to as he had initially thought. The man felt even worse because he had spent a lot of effort on it and nothing was working. His eyes started to close and it became clear that he was losing consciousness. His wife came to his aid. She saved him and gave him some water to drink. Realizing this, he became very angry because he didn't even realize how he had drunk so much water at one time. Besides, it was their last bottle and there were no more supplies left. However, she thought that there was no point in saving because he was dying, and if it weren't for this water, she wouldn't have been able to save him. Suddenly, someone knocked on their front door. Because of this, they were very scared because it seemed to be people. In fact, it was a girl who somehow managed to get to their house. However, they were in no hurry to open the door and didn't want to let her inside. She showed them a bag of food and water that she managed to save and wanted to share with him because she couldn't get to their apartment earlier because of the huge number of zombies. Delighted, the woman wanted to open the door. However, at the last moment, he stopped her, not allowing her to do so. He tried to calm her down and wanted her to behave quietly and not make any noise. She continued to talk and tried to convince them that she had a lot of water and other resources. However, the man replied that he was not going to open the door. After that, they saw the girl just leave. In fact, the woman could not understand her husband's behavior. However, it was impossible to believe that someone could remain so kind in such a difficult situation. He was convinced that they were trying to deceive them and come up with a way to get inside their house and rob everything. They were very upset about the situation. However, they decided not to open the door to anyone anymore. Suddenly, they heard the voice of their neighbors begging for help. Very quickly, they realized that they had made the right decision, because if they had opened the door, they would have been in her place. The same woman who offered them help was now dragging the victim's body into her home. After that, the suspicious woman returned. She again approached their door and began to threaten with a knife. She promised to return and take revenge. The main character tried to calm his wife and said that her words were a bluff and she was only trying to scare them. They continued to live as before. They only gave their daughter the necessary amount of water that was needed for survival. As before, they did not drink water, therefore their body suffered greatly. However, this time, she received less water than before. The girl wanted more, but now they had to save the liquid. The father tried to explain that she had to be patient until water appeared in their apartment. Then she could drink as much as she wanted. The girl agreed to wait because she knew that her parents did not drink anything at all. Suddenly, several shots and strong blows were heard. The sounds came from the bathroom, and very quickly they realized that it was the neighbors who were trying to destroy the wall that separated their houses. It became clear that it was a woman who was threatening them, and she was trying to find any way to get into their apartment. The husband wanted his wife to take the child, but she wanted to stay to meet him and protect their home. But he couldn't let her or their daughter get hurt, especially since if she stayed, she would only distract him. However, she was afraid for him and that he wouldn't be able to cope on his own. Moreover, their enemies were armed, so she left, leaving him alone. Meanwhile, the husband began to prepare for battle and gathered all the necessary equipment that would be needed during the defense of his own home. He began to prepare, and in order to protect his body, he placed a hard plate. He also wrapped his hand in a large layer of tape. After that, he began to collect other equipment and hid a sharp weapon in his clothes. The hole in the wall became so large that the neighboring apartment was visible. He was very nervous, but continued to wait, not intending to retreat. Then, he took a desperate step. In order to stop the attackers, he used a gas cylinder and lit a flame. He hoped that this would stop them and show that he would not give up so easily. But it had no effect. His body was pierced with a sharp spear that was made by his own hands. Opposite him, he saw a man who was his neighbor. He smiled and promised to kill them in order to take all the supplies. He ran out of gas and could no longer hold him back, so he started climbing into his room. The main character understood that he needed to try to attack first. However, he did not have time to do this and missed a painful blow to the stomach. He was very hurt, but he had to hold on for the sake of saving his own family. He started to fight, despite the severe pain and bleeding, but the enemy managed to catch his hand and block the attack. Now they started to fight each other and everything depended only on physical strength. The main character took a desperate step and tried to strike with his head. It worked, because his opponent lost his balance and the man managed to gain the upper hand. He found himself on top and tried to stab him with his own knife. To do this, he pressed his whole body against him. But he did not notice at all how the same woman who threatened them ended up behind him. Her face was burned because she was injured by the flames. She was hungry, so despite the severe burns, she tried to stab him with a knife. But at the last moment, the hero managed to dodge her blow. By chance, she stabbed her ally's hand and he began to scream in severe pain. Then, the main character again struck a powerful blow to kill her. Now the enemy had no allies left, and besides, he was wounded. The same fate awaited him? Everything was over and the enemies were dead. After the battle, the man felt very bad. His wounds hurt, and he was exhausted. He dropped to the ground to catch his breath. For the first time in his life, he had to kill a person. However, he couldn't relax, and right now, he was going to check what was in their apartment. The priority was water, which he was trying to find. To do this, he needed to go around the entire room and check every shelf. Suddenly, he noticed a strange closet. Opening it, he saw a huge number of human body parts. The smell in the picture made him feel sick. However, then he saw another object that caught his attention. It was an armored box, and it seemed like there might be valuable things inside. There was also a closet there, and he tried to check what was inside. Fortunately, there was water. But he was in no hurry to drink it because it could be poisoned. Enemies couldn't be trusted. In addition, he saw a key on the table. His wife continued to wait for him in another room with her daughter. And when she saw him, she was very happy. He was alive, and besides, he had found water. Jai's wounds were not deep, so they needed to be treated. There was no heavy bleeding, and he felt normal. Now, his daughter Kay could drink the water he managed to find. Despite the fact that his wounds were not serious, Jai was in a lot of pain. His daughter and wife did not leave him because they loved and feared him. His wife sat by his bed for so long that she fell asleep. But when she woke up, she noticed that her husband was no longer lying there. He got dressed and was going to fix the air conditioner so that they would have water. The woman could not understand where he got so much strength to continue working. In the neighbor's room, he found a battery. If he could, he would be able to start the air conditioner. He needed to do everything possible to get condensate and be able to produce enough water. He was very nervous that you tried to do everything right and very carefully so as not to break anything. And when he started the air conditioner, she really started to bathe. All the people were very happy because now they had the opportunity to produce at least a little water, which was so necessary for their survival. The next night, he lay awake, holding the neighbor's key in his hands. The woman noticed this and couldn't understand what he was constantly thinking about and why he was so tense. In fact, he knew about the existence of a small car that belonged to the neighbors. It was parked a few meters from their house, and he could use it. Hearing this, she started crying, trying to stop him. But her father didn't listen to her. He wanted to do everything possible to go in search of supplies and ensure the survival of his family. She cried, but even that didn't stop him. Very soon, they would run out of all their food, and there was only enough water for a few days. They risked dying of hunger or being killed by a zombie attack. He couldn't watch his family slowly die, and something had to be done. Even if it was a small chance of winning, he had to try because he would never see his family get hurt. Now, there were far fewer zombies on the streets of the city, and he hoped he could get to his car and stay alive. But what would happen next? He didn't even know how to drive a car. He didn't have a driver's license. Jai was going to get to the nearest sports supermarket and try to find some food for his family. He hoped he would be able to find water, too. She didn't seem to be thrilled with his ideas, but she understood that it was critical for their survival and agreed. The next day, the protagonist began to prepare for his journey. He put on all the necessary equipment that would protect him. It was very difficult to say goodbye to his family because he risked never seeing them again. Finally, they hugged and he saw his girl start to cry. However, there was no time and he left, having only hope in his heart. He tried to move very quickly and did everything as carefully as possible so as not to attract attention. The events moved to our time. The main character was trapped. As before, there were a lot of zombies on the streets of the city, and they began to surround him. Now he was in real danger because his car started to burn and he could not get out. It seemed that the flames scared the monsters very much and they began to retreat. This gave the man a certain advantage, and after a lot of effort, he finally managed to leave his car. Despite the fact that his clothes were burning, he started moving and tried to escape from them. He realized that they were afraid of the flames because at that moment they could not get close to him. In order to protect himself, he needed to find a safe place, and he started trying to climb the tower. He threw off his burnt clothes and was very lucky not to get serious burns or injuries. After that, he started to run away from the monsters along the power lines. When the flames died down, the zombies started to chase the hero, not giving him the opportunity to break away from them. Now that he was on the other side, he needed to get rid of his pursuers, and he started to cut the power lines. Very quickly, a huge number of zombies were on the ground. But even now, he did not stop and continued to climb further. He was lucky because not far from him, he saw an open car and hoped that it would start and he would be able to escape on it. Also, there were the keys, and this meant that he had a new chance for salvation. He tried to carefully get closer to the car, after which he was ready to jump to the ground. He did everything so quickly that he was able to climb inside and close himself there. Now he only had to hope that the car ran on gasoline. Despite the danger, he tried to do everything carefully and calmly. He succeeded. Now he had a car again and could continue to escape. The man was moving too fast to avoid getting stuck in the crowd of the dead again. However, he didn't even notice that he wasn't alone in the car. There was just a zombie behind him who was about to bite him. Jai was lucky enough to see him in the rearview mirror, and he braked. The monster flew out through the windshield. After that, he continued to move, right into a huge crowd of zombies. He was forced to give them his own car because he simply had no other choice. If he stopped, he would simply die, and he would no longer have any chance to get out of the environment. Suddenly, he saw a weapon in his cabin. Jai was very happy because he hoped that it worked and there were bullets there. Now he could shoot zombies who managed to get inside his car through the broken glass. There were few bullets, so he tried not to waste them. Due to the huge number of mutants, his car started to skid. He was not an experienced driver, so he could not cope with the steering. Unfortunately, he flew off the bridge and started to fall, and the zombies who continued to pursue him began to jump into the cold water right behind him. Now, his car was in the water and its interior began to flood. The zombies could not swim, so they began to drown, suffocating from lack of oxygen. And when his car sank to a sufficient depth, he held his breath and left the interior. G managed to reach the surface, which was covered with dead bodies of monsters. This was the only safe way, so he did not leave the water. After a while, G became very tired and decided to stop by the pipe to rest. He understood that his strength was running out and decided to stay there for a while. Jai hoped that the place was safe and that they would not be able to get him there. He lay in this state until late at night. Exhausted, he fell asleep and slept like that for several hours. But he had a terrible dream in which his daughter Kori was attacked by mutants. This dream made him wake up. Now he had to keep counting, despite the terrible pain and fatigue he felt. Ahead there was a dark tunnel, but that did not stop him. There were a lot of ugly insects on his way. However, he continued to crawl. Now he found himself in a sewer where there were a lot of cockroaches and dirt. He couldn't get to the surface because he had no weapons and his pistols were low on ammo, so he decided to move through the sewers. He didn't know if it was safe and only hoped that the mutants wouldn't have time to get to the sewers. In addition, there were many other dangers there because everything around him was trained and could collapse at any moment. From memory, he managed to get to the local store, which was not too far from their house. Jai carefully looked at the street and realized that there were too many mutants. Suddenly, one of them noticed a strange noise. he heard the sound of a hatch. Therefore, the monster began to head towards the source of the noise, trying to find its new victim. And when the danger passed, he was finally able to get to the surface. Jai wanted to go through the back door, but the door was locked. He tried to open it, although it made a lot of noise. To do this, Jai put a lot of effort, but he couldn't do anything. He already thought about giving up, because he was convinced that he was wasting precious time. However, thoughts about his own family did not let him stop. He did everything only for them. At the cost of enormous effort and pain, he succeeded. The door opened and now he could go inside. The store was very dirty and dark. Also, he heard strange sounds, so he decided to arm himself with a metal pipe. In addition, the furniture and doors inside were broken, which meant only one thing: there were monsters there. Carefully and slowly, he entered the room. It was a room with shelves that once held products. But now it was empty. He saw no food or water. He was preceded by other people who were also looking for supplies and were hungry. After carefully examining the entire room, he saw a strange hole in the wall of the store. He did not know where this would lead him, but he decided to check. When he entered the room, he found himself in another room, but the feeling of anxiety did not leave him. Jai was very tense. He tried to move carefully so as not to make noise and not to attract attention. Suddenly, he saw a little girl in front of him, and it seemed that she was standing near a well with water. The man had hope because now he believed that he had finally found a source of water. But when the girl saw him, she was very scared and started to run away. She hid in a hole in the wall, leaving a bucket of water. Carefully, the main character approached him. He could not believe his eyes because now he could drink enough. He was happy because his efforts were not in vain. It was at this moment that the girl ran to her parents. Her mother was cruelly abused. She suffered terrible torment for the survival of her own family. Her daughter was very scared when she saw everything with her own eyes. The fat man got angry when he saw her and tried to hurt the girl. He threatened to feed her to zombies because she didn't listen to him, but her mother always stood up for her. Suddenly, he felt that there was a gun near his head. Now, the fat man was silent. He didn't risk moving because he was afraid that the stranger was a bandit and would shoot him. They all looked at each other. It became very quiet. The fat man tried to explain that he didn't really need trouble and they were all good people. In addition, he explained that he actually loved his child and was just raising her because she didn't listen to him. However, the main character doesn't believe a single word he says. In exchange for his own life, he promised to give him all the food and water they had. Also, when he offered him to eat right now, he wanted to do everything possible to make his own life better. The woman started screaming, trying to warn her husband because he didn't listen to the fat man because he was a traitor and a liar. With his own hands, he killed a lot of people. In addition, he took her own husband and now mocked him. Hearing this, he got very angry and tried to hit her. However, Jai stopped him. He started threatening him with a gun again. Suddenly, the big man grabbed his hand and tried to take away his weapon. In addition, he hit the main character, which made him lose his balance. Great, the advantage was on his side. He started threatening the main character with a gun again, but he did not give in to his provocations. He waited for the right moment, and when he did not, he dealt a strong blow, breaking his head. The dead body of the ugly man fell to the ground. When the woman and her daughter realized that he was dead, they cried. But they were very happy because now we could not be free. Also, she thought that the main character was a criminal and was ready to give anything he asked for, just so that he would not touch her daughter. However, Jai stood silently and watched them cry. He explained that he also had a daughter and he did not even intend to hurt them. In order to calm them down, he hid the weapon and promised not to even touch them. Also, it became known that during the quarantine, there were 57 people in this room and they were the ones who remained alive. Jai could not believe that the fat man was capable of such a thing and killed everyone else. He wanted to know what really happened and why everyone died. However, she could not speak. She just burst into tears. After the zombies appeared, all the people tried to find a source of water, which everyone was so lacking. Her husband was able to get to the water and was ready to share it with all the other people who also needed it. All the people respected him because he became their hero and savior. Also, they wanted to make him the main one among their group of people, and it was he who could give orders and manage all of them. Everyone trusted him, so he was ready to try to do it and take on such responsibility. However, there was another unresolved problem: food, which would also run out very quickly. Therefore, they were going to break through the wall to the store to provide themselves with everything they needed and continue to survive. All the people agreed to do it. Therefore, he began to break through the wall first, showing everyone his example. Of all the people, only the fat man behaved very strangely and suspiciously. He suggested that the man rest and was going to work instead of him. At first, he behaved normally and even helped people. They all became friendly because now they had a common goal for which they worked. People were happy when they were able to get a lot of food and drinks. However, sooner or later, the food would run out, and if they did not save, they would quickly start dying of hunger. He was going to give out food in equal portions every day, and the oldest in their group was to store the food. In addition, they were going to start growing their own plants and tending to the harvest. None of the people took his words seriously. They could not imagine how they could grow their own food. Also, they were scared that they would have to go up to the surface to do so. Now that they had water, they could also plant plants on the roof, but for that, they had to move the soil to the ground floor. If everything worked out, in a few months, they would be able to eat the food they had grown themselves. Everyone was delighted with this idea. Very soon, they began to prepare to plant the crop. First of all, they selected potatoes that were starting to sprout. After the land was tilled and prepared, the women began to plant the plants. They did everything carefully so that each plant would sprout. None of them doubted that they would succeed because they had enough water to water their plants. They just had to wait for the time to come for everything to grow. The people were happy. After a while, some shoots began to sprout. Then, almost all the plants took root and began to grow. Because of the large amount of water they were watered with, they grew very quickly. But one of the men could not help himself. He picked the crop and started to eat it, right from the ground. The chief did not like it, so he wanted to punish him. His behavior disrupted the order and left many others without food. He tried to explain to the man that now he was not just a sprout that could be eaten when it grew up. But the man was so hungry that he was ready to endure beatings, and the chief could not hold back. He beat him severely because of what he had done. When he returned, he met his grandparents. They were waiting for him because they had a very serious conversation. They checked that no one was listening to them, after which they went with him to their room. However, the fat man was watching everything that was happening and saw how Jong beat the man who wanted to eat. He became very curious and wanted to listen to their conversation and find out what they were really talking about. The old people told him that recently they had been giving people as little food as possible, which is why the riot started. With the amount they had left, there was only enough food for a few days. In fact, there was only enough food left for a month, and in order not to cause panic among the crowd, they lied. Because of this, they found themselves in a critical situation. This meant that they would have to starve for a whole month until the potatoes grew. As soon as the food ran out, everyone would start eating the potatoes that had not had time to ripen. Because of this, everyone would die. They were also worried that a food war might break out and people might commit terrible crimes for food. They hoped that Zhang would be able to persuade the crowd to wait and calm down, and he promised to do so. The fat man heard their entire conversation. After a while, a famine began in the camp. The people refused to work because they did not receive food and had no strength. They felt very bad, and because of the hunger, they could not stand on their feet. Instead, they wanted to force the fat man to work because he, due to his large fat reserves, felt much better. In response, the fat man also mocked them and called them lazy because they refused to work. He also lied to them that he had food, which made them immediately stand up and try to make peace with him. The fat man began to ask them if the men were really that hungry. And then the fat man told everything he had heard from Zhang's conversation. He called the man a traitor because he had deceived his people. He also said that it was Grandma, Grandpa, and Zhang who had eaten their food and lied about having enough. When the men heard this, they wanted revenge. Immediately, they ran to Zhang, but before that, they took more people with them to make sure they had the upper hand. They all started shouting, demanding that they be given their food, which they all needed so much. They considered the old men traitors who had deceived everyone and eaten up all the supplies. Soon, Zhang came to them. Everyone began to tell him about what had happened and accused him of lying. However, Zhang could not believe his ears. He did not expect that the people he had worked so hard for would now start accusing him. However, many of the people were losing consciousness due to hunger. And then, Zhang said that the supplies were much less than they were told at the time, but explained that he just didn't want to cause panic. Everyone started whispering. They seemed to understand. However, the fat man couldn't accept it. He rushed at the man and tried to hit him. In response, Zhang dealt a strong blow that stopped him. Immediately, a fight broke out. All the people were fighting among themselves for the food. The fight was so fierce that people were seriously injured. Zhang ordered everyone to stop because this could not continue. He was saddened to see his once friendly people turn into barbarians who were ready to kill each other for a piece of bread. In order to reconcile them, he allowed the people to take their share of food, but warned them that the consequences would be terrible. After all, they would lose everything, and the harvest, for which everyone had worked so hard, would be destroyed. Because of his words, everyone calmed down, but no one wanted to harvest the food. The next night, all the men gathered on the roof of the building. The fat man tried to persuade them to carry out a coup and defeat Zhang, because he was a thief who stole their food. The fat man believed that Zhang was trying to do everything possible so that the people would simply die of hunger. And instead of slowly dying, they had to go and take their share by force. He wanted to kill everyone who disagreed with him. At that moment, he took out a knife, but the people remained calm. The fat man shouted, calling them cowards. However, in reality, there were not so many men who were ready to side with the fat man. Zhang had many more men, however, the fat man considered them inexperienced and hoped that they would be able to win. And suddenly the first man joined him, who was also hungry and considered Zhang a traitor. Then the next one joined, and gradually, almost all the men who were on the roof sided with him and agreed to fight for food. Suddenly one of them got up, his stomach hurt, so he wanted to go to the toilet. However, the fat man did not let him do this. Instead, he simply stabbed him with his own knife. No one could believe their own eyes and that the fat man was capable of such a step. The body of the dead man was lying on the ground. This was the first victim. Now, everyone had to touch his body in order to show their confidence and readiness for battle. The first volunteer who was ready to do this appeared. He took the fat man's knife and confidently approached his dead body. After that, he stabbed him right in the back. Finally, the fat man was truly pleased that he had managed to attract allies to his side. They started to descend and intended to find the main character and his team, but instead met his daughter. She did not suspect that the men were evil and could hurt her, so she smiled at them and wanted to give them a flower. Seeing her, the fat man was very happy because he understood that he could blackmail Zhang's head. After that, he became very angry and was going to kill the child, even though she was small and could not defend herself. At this moment, Zhang appeared, who ran to her scream. When he saw what had happened, he could not calm down. Despite the fact that he was alone, this did not stop him and he continued to fight them. He managed to hold off the attackers for some time. But because there were many more of them, he was seriously injured. In addition, he killed several of them. The dead bodies of the attackers lay on the ground. Because the leader was much stronger, no one could get close to him, and they were all afraid to die. With his strength and courage, despite his terrible wounds, he managed to stop the attack. At this moment, the fat man was very scared because he understood that Zhang would want him. In order to protect himself, he tried to cover himself with the body of his comrade, because of which he died. After that, he pushed the men away from him. Zhang tried to convince them to stop before it was too late because of his wounds, he could not continue fighting. However, they did not want to stop because they understood that they had a huge advantage when they defeated the strongest. The fat man tried to convince the people that they were on the right path. Therefore, they continued to fight and kill everyone. They managed to destroy a huge number of people and capture everyone who tried to hide, including women, children, and old people. They threw them down to feed the zombies. But that's all that ended there, because after that, he turned people against each other, and they staged a massacre, as a result of which everyone died. Only he managed to escape and stay alive. When the main character heard this story, he was touched. He looked around the room in which they lived and noticed that there were a lot of different tools. This equipment was collected by her dead husband. He believed that people would need it in order to continue to survive and in the future fight against other groups of people like him. The main character chose the most necessary things for himself that he wanted to take with him. After that, he decided to deal with the fat man. The man was unconscious, so he had to tie him up. He wasn't dead, but he had lost consciousness due to a strong blow to the head. After a while, he started to wake up. But when he saw the situation he was in, he got very scared and started to apologize to the man. But the man wasn't going to forgive him after everything he had heard. He started to undress him, taking off all his clothes. After that, he cut him into small pieces. He put one of them in his mouth so that his screams wouldn't be heard. Now, the woman and her daughter could avenge the death of their husband and father. They could do anything to get revenge, even kill him if they wanted to. At that moment, he approached the girl and gave her the metal stick. He believed that this was the right decision because now she could avenge the death of her father. However, he ordered that she not overdo it and accidentally kill him because he could be very useful. The girl agreed and took the weapon from him. She approached her victim and hit him on the head with her strength. Her mother joined her and together they began to beat him. Meanwhile, the main character tried to take as many supplies with him as possible because he believed that this was his loot that he had earned. Also, he wanted to eat, so he tried to eat as much as possible in order to at least restore his strength a little. After that, when he was going to check if his house was visible from this place, he carefully looked at the high-rise buildings, trying to understand if there were any living people left in them. And when he realized that there was no one there, he became very sad. There were no lights in the houses. It only meant that the people there were dead. Also, he looked into his own house, which also had no lights. Because of this, he became very sad and tried to hold back his tears. The girl understood that he was very difficult and offered him water. The man drank the water with joy and thanked her for it. She also asked if he was trying to find his home where his family lived. However, the man replied that his parents, with whom he had lost contact for a long time, were not far from here. He hoped that they might be alive and were waiting for someone to save them. She thought that he was going to save his parents and wanted to go in search of them right now. The man just sighed heavily. The main character was not going to do this because he did not have enough strength and resources to take them with him. He also told about his daughter, who really wanted water and was waiting for his return, so when he was about to leave, suddenly the little girl screamed. This saved the main character's life because he noticed her mother trying to attack him. At that moment, he managed to dodge and grab her by the neck. Jai did not understand why she did this, because he saved her and saved her from terrible torment. Therefore, Jie began to threaten her with a knife and was also going to kill her. At the last moment, he thought about his own girl. He felt sorry to leave the child without parents. Therefore, this made him stop and change his mind. He let go of the woman, but did not take his eyes off her. Now he could no longer understand who he should be more afraid of, zombies or people. The poor woman was exhausted and lowered her weapon. She regretted her actions and started crying. Now that her husband, who had always tried to help everyone, had died, she had lost trust in people and could not believe that she had been saved for nothing. Also, she felt very weak and could not continue to protect her daughter. Jai felt sorry for her, but he could not change anything. After all, now all people were suffering and going through difficult trials. Human kindness was now becoming a weakness, and it was necessary to think only about their own survival. However, he believed that they still had the right to choose and could choose their own path for themselves. He admitted that from the very beginning he wanted to kill them both, but the choice to believe them almost killed him. He understood that if people did not change, they would continue to kill each other, and I would not be able to win for anything, and the apocalypse would never end. Perhaps her dead husband thought the same, and that was why he was dead now. Perhaps he paid for his own kindness and the fact that he trusted people. Hearing these words, the woman began to cry. She remembered all the moments that connected her with her lover. Suddenly, a shot rang out. This sound was very close, and the main character rushed to the window to check what was really happening. When he turned the binoculars, he saw a terrible picture. It would be about two groups of people who were on neighboring houses. It seemed that both groups had run out of supplies and now they were trying to kill each other. One of them was much stronger because they had armor and weapons. The bravest and strongest of the men were going to storm the neighboring building. They managed to break into the crowd and start destroying everyone in their path. The war was very cruel and neither side was ready to surrender. A lot of people were dying, and those who were the least lucky fell down, where they were torn apart by zombies. The battle was very cruel, and there was a terrible scream and poor people who gave their lives for a ghostly hope. The strongest had firearms and ammunition. Therefore, they shot each other from the stands and did not risk their own lives. In addition, people managed to invent powerful weapons, which became fire cocktails. They threw them into a crowd of people, from which they received terrible burns. But even this did not stop many of them. They continued to fight despite the terrible injuries, because the survival of the entire crowd depended on each of them. Suddenly, the main character saw his own parents fighting on one of the sides. He could not believe his own eyes, because he saw how hard it was for his father, and realized that they were alive. Now he realized that his parents were in real danger, because the Borgs managed to go over to their side and throw a net over them. After that, they were in danger and the enemies began to beat them with their feet and other objects. Jai cried, but he had no way to change anything and somehow help them. He watched as his parents and other unfortunate people were beaten to death, and I wanted to throw them down until they were devoured by mutants. Also, the head of the enemy camp came to their side and was going to kill all those who were not going to obey him. The people who managed to be taken prisoner were going to be transported to the other side. In fact, they wanted to use them as slaves who would work for the enemy camp. His parents were one of them, and Ji saw their bodies being carried inside the house. The woman realized that these were his parents. They were engaged in the transformation of people, so they were allowed to stay alive. And then, the woman realized that most likely they would be prepared, because they knew a lot of important information about other people and the routes where there were the fewest mutants. Jai asked his father to be patient. He was going to come to his aid and free him from captivity. But the woman heard about his plan, could not believe how he would be able to cope with armed and strong enemies on his own. However, he did not know whether he would be able to win or whether he would be able to survive at all. But if he did not do this, then his parents would definitely die. That now she realized that he was actually very similar to her husband and spoke the same way as him. Therefore, she did not doubt that he would succeed and believed in his victory. For this, the man sent to the garage in order to choose the best weapon for himself and be ready for battle. He managed to find a huge amount of various equipment. He carefully examined all the objects that came across his path. Then he started tinkering, trying to assemble the best and most powerful equipment for himself. He used absolutely everything that came to his hands. After some time, he managed to assemble a weapon that could shoot nails. Now he wanted to test its effectiveness. He realized that with its help, it was easy to test the human body and inflict serious injuries. He continued to prepare, and now he needed to try to make some armor for himself. At the same time, he remembered pictures from his childhood when he was a little boy. During his school years, he was often bullied and did not have enough physical strength to defend himself. However, his father always supported him and made him stand up for himself. He knew that his son was not respected and beaten. He had weak hands, so when he tried to make a man out of him, the father wanted his son to finally become braver and start defending himself. To do this, he needed to take revenge on his enemies and make them stop touching him. His father kept telling him that he needed to be responsible and brave. He could lose the battle, but he needed to repay the same and never give up. The boy didn't take his words seriously, but he knew that he was telling the truth. He decided to listen to his advice and do everything as he said. After he returned home, even more new wounds and bruises appeared on his body. The father immediately noticed that something had happened to his son. When his mother saw what he looked like, she was very scared. However, Ji didn't say anything. He didn't want his parents to know about what had happened. But the father noticed the bruises on his hands and realized that he had finally been able to defend himself. He smiled imperceptibly and was actually very proud of his son. On the first day, he and his father were called to school. He was taken to the principal's office where he was forced to apologize to the person he had beaten. Even though he was not to blame for what had happened and was only defending himself, no one listened to him. The father of his abuser was very rich and allowed himself to call the main character names. But Ji's father supported his son in any situation and considered him right. Now, a quarrel began between the men and they risked a fight right in the school. Even the fact that there were significantly more opponents did not scare the man, and he was ready to take revenge on all of them for the sake of his son. He was alone against the whole crowd and had to defend himself. However, he very easily dealt with all of them and remained unharmed. Now, he was able to take revenge on his own son and became a real pride and example for him. This brought them very close, and the boy remained forever grateful to his father for changing his life. Meanwhile, he continued to tinker and tried to develop deadly weapons. There was a huge number of different tools in the room from which he tried to develop different things. One of these was a rocket launcher, which he filled with a lot of debris and sharp nails. He believed that this weapon would be truly dangerous against a huge crowd of people. Suddenly, a woman approached him. She gave him her husband's jacket because they had the same size of clothes. The main character thanked her for the gift and asked if he had any plan. But at first, he needed to get to the neighboring house, and then when he didn't know what to do, now he climbed onto the roof. He took the fat man with him. He was going to use him as bait. Therefore, he cold-bloodedly pushed him off the roof of the house. Now, the fat man was doomed. Terrible torment and a slow death awaited him. Taking advantage of the moment, he tried to get to the neighboring house. The mutants began to tear his body into small pieces. In all this time, he remained alive but could not do anything. Jai watched how the mutants reacted to the food and tried to move very quickly and quietly. There was a lot of different equipment on him, so it was difficult for him. But still, having made a huge amount of effort, he managed to overcome a long distance and end up on the same house. All the time, a woman was watching him with her daughter. She did not believe that he would be able to defeat a huge crowd of people alone, and the worst thing was that his family was waiting for him at home. The girl believed that the main character would survive and win. Tears appeared in the woman's eyes because she also wanted this. Now that he had filled up on the neighboring house, he was ready to enter the room. It was the place where his parents had been taken. Despite the fact that he was very scared, there was no going back. He gathered himself and with all his might jumped into the room. But surprisingly, it was very quiet there. When he looked around the entire room, he saw nothing at all. Even when he calmed down, he calmly and quietly began to move on. Instead, there was a huge amount of blood in the room. Its trail stretched to some kind of open door, and he was going to move along it, trying to find his own family. On his way, he saw a huge number of corpses and human bodies that were scattered throughout the house. Many of them died of hunger or other diseases that developed in a closed room. He understood that he needed to be as careful as possible and not attract anyone. First of all, he wanted to know in which direction he needed to move and where to look for his enemies. So he began to listen. Now he had an understanding of which direction the screams of people were coming from, and he went in search of them. He had to move through the bloody trail that stretched through the entire house. Trying not to attract attention and not to make noise, Jai carefully started climbing the stairs. He saw a lot of bloodstains on the walls and floor. Despite the fact that he was in a house with many enemies, he was not afraid, and for the sake of saving his own family, he stopped. Suddenly, he saw a light in one of the rooms opposite him. Looking in there, he saw a man sitting with his back to him and did not see the main character. He managed to overhear his conversation. That evening, there was to be a feast in the main house, lots of alcohol and food. They discussed the details of their operation and the war they had managed to win. Because they had won, they started drinking and forgot that they were on guard duty. This was a good chance for the main character, and he took advantage of it. When the men lost their vigilance, he attacked them and started killing them one by one. In a panic, they tried to fight him off, but nothing worked. They were all dead. He didn't give anyone a chance to escape and was ruthless. Suddenly, the man heard a strange sound and saw a glass of blood on the shelf. Very soon, he realized that there were still people alive inside. The sound came from the closet where the criminal could be hiding. Therefore, he wanted to force the enemy to come out of it, keeping him at gunpoint. The criminal was a child and did not want to suffer, so he asked to just kill him. But Ji was in no hurry. He wanted to find out where his parents were and whether they were even alive. There was a bridge on the roof of the building that connected this house with the main building. He did not believe the boy, so he wanted to kill him. However, he asked how old he really was. As it turned out, he was only 14 years old. And this made the man stop. He could not so easily take the life of a child, even though he was his enemy. Jai did not kill him. Instead, he tied the boy tightly. He also covered his mouth so that he would not start screaming and calling for help. Jai left the little one in the same room and went to save his parents. Now he needed to get to the main building that connected these houses. To do this, he needed to go out onto the roof again. There were a lot of enemies there, so he had to do everything very quickly and carefully. But when he got there, he didn't see anyone. Now he tried to find the very bridge the boy had spoken of. As it turned out, it was very close, so the man noticed him right away. But when he was about to go to the next house, he stopped because he heard a strange sound behind him. The man turned sharply to make sure that he was not in danger. However, he saw a man behind him. He was scared and crying. The unknown wanted to be spared and was scared. Jai was going to shoot him to end his suffering. However, the unknown stopped him. He had children, and he wanted them to stay alive. But when he looked into the face of the main character, he changed to recognize him. Jai did not understand anything, who this man really was. Suddenly, he took out a weapon and tried to wound the main character. But he did not succeed because Ji was ready for this and expected that the enemy would try to deceive him. He shot him right in the face and took his life in cold blood. After that, his dead body flew down, where the mutants would start to tear him apart. Jai just calmly watched what was happening. When the danger passed, he began to move along the bridge, and he heard his enemy screaming, who even after being shot in the face remained alive, and now his body was being torn to pieces. He calmly moved on. However, he noticed that there were a lot of mutants on the street. The monsters were hungry, and very quickly ate the bodies of all the people who were below. Now he managed to get to the neighboring house, just Ji was inside. In front of him, he saw two people. There was music playing and everyone was drinking. Therefore, they simply did not pay attention to him, and Jai passed by them, not drawing attention to himself. This time he was lucky, but he had to be very careful and try to behave inconspicuously. Inside, there was a real celebration. Heavy music was playing, and everyone was dancing and having fun. They were the winners in the war, so they wanted to celebrate. Also, in the middle of the hall sat the chief, surrounded by food and women. He was the main organizer of this celebration. Also, inside, there were many prisoners who were going to be tortured in front of everyone. In order to stay alive and become members of their clan, the poor people had to eat pieces of human flesh. The crowd liked it, so they started screaming. Some tried to do it, but they failed. Then, they were faced with a cruel punishment. They were simply killed. People simply had no choice. They were forced to do what they were told. Otherwise, they would simply be killed, and their bodies would be thrown to the monsters. Suddenly, the same boy appeared in the crowd. He managed to untie himself and get inside the house. But when he tried to tell the leader about what happened, he didn't believe him because he thought that the kid was just trying to ruin everyone's holiday. But it was too late because the main character was inside the house. He opened fire with his own weapon. Now, all the people inside realized that the war was not over, but they didn't know who the main character was and how he managed to get inside the house. The leader wanted to eat him alive because the unknown had caused him great damage and many of his people were dead. Now, the main character was going to do everything possible to continue killing enemies. And in order to remain unnoticed, he turned off the light and the whole room was in darkness. Those who had a flashlight were lucky because they could see the main character. Now they tried to block the stairs to prevent the man from getting inside their room and shooting them all. Suddenly, the main character disappeared. Instead, he threw an explosive mixture at the enemies. Now everything was in flames and people began to burn alive. The chief urgently ordered everyone to put out the fire because they simply had no way to leave the room. A lot of people got burns trying to put out the fire. And those who dared to run away, the main character was waiting and simply shot. He sat in the darkness and waited for people to come to him. The flames were able to hold them back. He had time to try to find all the prisoners. The man was lucky because at the end of the corridor he saw a light and his parents were sitting in a cage. Emotions overwhelmed him. But when he saw what was done to all the prisoners, his heart almost stopped. He urgently needed to do something because he risked simply not having time to save them. Meanwhile, the enemies managed to put out the flames and were already trying to find him. G managed to hide behind the stairs and held his breath so that they would not hear him. Despite the danger, he started moving. He tried to go down a few floors below, but there he saw mutants who managed to break inside. There were so many of them that G had to run away. The only way to escape was up the mountain, so he started running straight there. But when he broke away from them, he was able to block the door. Jai didn't believe that such protection could stop them completely, but now he had some time. The man decided to take a risk. For this, he was going to let the monsters inside. He hoped that they wouldn't see him and would just run past. But suddenly, the same boy who told everyone about him appeared in front of him. He wanted to kill him, but there was no time for this, so he just ran on. Very soon, the monsters would burst into the house, destroying everything in their path. The door broke, and the little boy saw a huge number of mutants in front of him. The people who were trapped screamed and called for help, but nothing could save them. Meanwhile, the prisoners were protected because a cage separated them from the monsters. They all pressed against the wall, trying to survive this terrible moment. Now, the main character's path to his boutiques was blocked. In order to get to the other part of the house, he had to go outside. He moved very carefully, trying to keep his balance. However, he saw in the window the same boy who miraculously managed to break away from the zombies and close himself in one of the rooms. But now, it became a trap for him, because in a little while the monsters would also break down his door. He tried to shout to the main character and ask to be saved. But the man did not have time for this. He needed to move on. Despite the fact that the monsters were already nearby, he decided to save him, because the boy was just a child. Therefore, he turned around and tried to break the net. He unbent it with his own hands so that the boy could get out, but warned him never to come into his sight again. The child's life was saved, and therefore, he continued to move on. Above him, he saw a window and realized that it was the same room where his poor parents were. He managed to get to them, and looking inside, he saw them. It was really them. They couldn't believe their eyes because they didn't even know if their son was alive. But now, he was saving them, trying to do everything to unbend the heavy metal. Together with them, he managed to save all the other prisoners, and now they were moving along a narrow passage. Any step could be their last, so everyone tried to move slowly and carefully. Now the main character began to climb up. He needed to get to the bridge that connected this house with another. But when he climbed, he saw that his enemies had managed to block the stairs and were still alive. They blocked the passage with all the objects they could get their hands on, and the people who remained there were doomed. They didn't let anyone in. Jai finally managed to get to the bridge, but when he was about to climb the mountain, he saw that there were a lot of enemies on him. They all tried to escape because this was the only way to salvation, but suddenly they noticed Jie and stopped. Many people, including the leader, remained inside. However, their defenses would soon be broken, so they had to retreat. They all quickly surfaced. However, the bridge was broken. The enemies were in mortal danger, but they saw Ji. He was moving along the ropes, trying to get to the other side. The hero knew he had been spotted. Now Jai realized that he was in real danger. He and his parents froze in anticipation of something terrible, and exactly what they feared most happened. The enemies had weapons, because the enemy shot straight at the man. A bloodstain appeared on his face. In addition, he felt such intense pain that he could barely hold on to the rope. Meanwhile, his wife could not calm down. In her arms was his daughter, who was constantly crying, waiting for her father to return. She heard shots and voices many blocks from her house, but she knew that something terrible had happened. She remembered how long before that she and her husband had watched a zombie movie. At that time, it seemed very terrible to her, and she simply could not watch it calmly. At that time, she could not even think that these events could become a reality for them. Now she was in the place of the hero of the movie, who was eagerly awaiting the return of her hero husband, who had risked his own life. Back then, they didn't think about how valuable the food they had was. And the zombies seemed so imaginary, and in reality, no one could believe that they existed. For some reason, the woman was not at ease, even though it was a movie. For a second, she imagined that all the events could actually happen to them. But even if that happened, the man promised to protect her at all costs. It seemed that he didn't believe that such a thing was possible. However, now that he was not around, she remembered his words and wanted to see him at least once. Due to the injury, the man started bleeding and almost fell off the rope. However, he made a lot of effort and endured great pain in order to hold on. After all, if he fell, then certain death would await him below. His father tried to shout to him, but Ji did not respond. Then, in order to save him, he climbed up to him and wanted to stop him from falling. Nevertheless, he managed to save his son. All the people helped him get to the neighboring house. The enemy continued to fire at them, but he ran out of ammunition. However, he had another weapon. It was a rope with which he could grab people and try to push them out of the house. A hook was tied to the end of it, so he could use it to reach the neighboring house. Other people had the same equipment, so now they were going to reach their house. Meanwhile, Ji began to provide assistance and tried to stop the heavy bleeding. But suddenly, they noticed that the enemy began to climb over to their side. Even the destroyed bridge did not stop them. The chief began to threaten them, especially he wanted to kill the main character, who had spoiled his holiday and doomed many of his people to death. However, this time, Ji did not have the strength to fight. Together with the other people, they began to retreat. Now the enemies were trying to reach their house and were doing everything possible to do so. In order to stop the attackers, people began to build fortifications. But to make their defense much more effective, they decided to set it on fire. They had very few items, so they used absolutely everything they could find to defend themselves. The enemies who began to approach them realized that the people had set the fire in order to stop them. But even because of this, they were not going to stop, because they could not believe that the people were really ready for such a desperate step and set a fire in the middle of the house. Therefore, they continued to move forward. The flames stopped them and the enemies moved on, receiving serious injuries and burns. At this moment, the main character and his greatest enemy met their eyes. The criminal managed to bend over the rich, suddenly a strong blow that Ji did not expect at all. The strong criminal began to kill the people who tried to stop him. A real massacre began and many men from both sides died. In the midst of the battle, he grabbed the main character and held him by the neck. Now that he had prepared to strike and was ready to kill him, however, his father appeared out of nowhere. He managed to stop the attacker and seriously injure him, in a row his own son's life. However, the enemy managed to dodge and remain unharmed. After that, he struck back directly in the man's stomach. But the man did not stop and continued to fight him. He managed to dodge many of his attacks, remaining unharmed. Then, the man realized that the man was very strong and skilled despite his age. And if he were younger, he would have definitely been able to kill him already. However, now he was not in such good shape as before. Because of this, the enemy managed to injure him. He started beating the old man, right in front of his son. Jai could calmly watch as his loved one was beaten in front of him. He wanted to stop it, however. He understood that he did not have much strength for this. Besides, he was wounded. Jai gathered his strength, and when the moment to attack came, he did it. Blow after blow, he began to beat the strong enemy. However, his allies stopped him. People united in order to stop the enemies and prevent them from passing further. For the first time, the mask flew off the enemy's face, and everyone saw his terrible face. The enemy promised that all his people would die. Suddenly, a strong explosion sounded behind him. The blast wave threw his body away, and the flash of flames was visible for many blocks from there. This was seen by a woman who had been constantly watching what was happening. The smoke and flames scared her very much. She could not believe that Ji had died. However, in reality, he was alive. The people were also alive, but many of them were seriously injured. At the same time, the main enemy was also alive. He was the only one who managed to survive, but he had serious wounds. In addition, he lost his fingers and could not get up. He had no leg, and very soon he risked dying from blood loss. Others began to climb out of the rubble, who also managed to survive. Now they were going to continue attacking people. But despite the order of the main one, none of them dared to do this. Despite the fact that he started screaming, they were not going to move further and attack the group of people. Suddenly, a sharp knife hit him right in the face. His own people began to kill him because they did not want to just go to certain death. The main character watched all this. They decided to leave them and wanted to leave the building before the flames completely engulfed it. Suddenly, the woman noticed the main character and was very happy when she realized that he had survived. Her daughter was also very happy when she saw that Ji had survived. Now, the woman thought about how she could show the man the direction in which he needed to move. Therefore, she ordered her daughter to bring a flashlight. In the dark, he was very visible. Therefore, Jai noticed him without any problems and knew in which direction he needed to move. That was where his salvation was, because the woman had enough food and water, which would last for a while for all of them. People began to move. They did it along the power lines. The main character, who was walking behind, cut the wires behind him so that the enemies could not catch up with them. Now they were safe because the enemies had no chance to catch up with them. After a while, they got inside their house. Suddenly, everyone started applauding him. Jai became their savior and saved many others besides his own parents. They were all proud of him and thanked him for the gift of life and salvation. Many of them had lost their own families and clans. However, now, they needed to come together in order to continue to survive. People had to support each other. In addition, the woman was ready to share all her own food and water supplies and allowed them to live in this house. She gave them hope for a new life, so they wanted him to become the main one. After the people regained their strength, they needed to leave their own house. He, along with his comrades, went outside to make a dangerous journey. However, moving on the surface was very dangerous because there were many mutants on the streets. Therefore, they chose the sewers, which remained the safest place. Others watched them and hoped that everything would work out for them. His father could not go with him because of his injuries, but he knew that his son was a hero. The men continued to move through a narrow tunnel. On their way, there was a lake that they had to cross. In order not to waste all their strength, they decided to use the inflatable rings that were in the house. The men managed to do this and they reached the land but immediately met the mutants. A fight began. They tried to kill the mutants that were approaching them. In order to continue moving, they had to get to the roof of the house. The men acted very well, so they tried to do it as quickly as possible. They had no chance of making a mistake because they were being chased by a lot of zombies all the time. At the cost of joint efforts, they ended up on the roof where the mutants could not reach them. And in order for them not to be able to reach them, they had to take away the ladder. Now, the men moved on, helping each other. Gradually, they approached their goal. Now, they were very close to the main character's house. Only a few blocks remained to be walked. Gio knew that his family was waiting for him, and he believed that everything was fine with them and they were alive. Ahead, the most difficult stage of the journey remained, because the distance to the neighboring house was very great, and the street that separated them was too wide and dangerous. Before moving on, they decided to rest and gain strength. The zombies that were on the street were very strong and fast. Also, one of the men knew that even they could not do without water and some kind of food. With his own eyes, he saw how the dead drank water from the ditch, ate cats, dogs, and other corpses. Moreover, they attacked each other. In addition, it was found out that the zombies could not swim and were afraid of fire. The virus attacked the human brain, and the person who was infected with it lost control over emotions and could not control himself. Also, people lost some of their physical sensations. The feeling of pain and fatigue became dull, and in fact, they felt almost nothing. It was also observed that the zombies had epileptic seizures, which occurred because the virus destroyed brain cells. Perhaps they became aggressive precisely when they saw people, and then the coordination of their movements became better. In addition, their hearts beat and they were alive because blood flowed from their bodies. The corpses of the dead did not rot and were not infected with infections. This meant that the virus could spread not only through a bite or the blood of an infected person. However, no one knew this. It was likely that there were other ways to get infected with the virus. The places in the city were very familiar to the men. They had played on one of the playgrounds when they were children. Suddenly, they remembered that there was a feed factory next to them. This meant that there was a lot of food. They were so busy that they didn't notice a group of people behind them. They were factory workers who didn't want to share their food, so they were advised to leave. At first, Jai thought that these people were cannibals, but when he looked closely into their leader's eyes, he realized that this was not the case. He tried to explain that they were not looking for shelter, but simply stopped on their territory to rest. The old man told them about the road that was below. He agreed to help them. The men didn't trust him, but they had no other choice. They decided to go with him because they had nothing to lose. Ji explained that he wanted to save his own family, which he left in the apartment. And the men who went with him were his friends, so they agreed to help. In addition, the main character noticed that many doors were locked. There were many mutants left inside the closed rooms, and the old man tried to conduct experiments on the infected. He wanted to try to understand the nature of the disease and find a cure. Now they came to the same place and began to go down. The men found themselves inside a narrow underground tunnel. For added security, there were metal bars and guards inside. Here, the old man was going to the people, and then when they were supposed to move on their own. He promised that at any moment they could return and use their passage. When the men were on the surface, they pulled the rope and began to move in the direction of Ji's house. They were almost there and had only a little longer to go. Jai could almost see his house, and now he had the feeling that he had been away from home for a whole year. Therefore, he wanted to see his family as soon as possible. However, the cage on the roof was open, which meant that there could be many mutants inside. Suddenly, they saw the first of them. The zombie immediately rushed at the men. There were so many mutants that people had to run away in order to save themselves. The chase continued, and they urgently needed to find a safe place for themselves. Suddenly, they found themselves on the edge of the house, surrounded by mutants. It seemed that there was no chance of salvation, and in a panic, Ji slipped. The man began to fall down. However, he was very lucky. Ji was able to catch his foot on the metal grate, so he stayed alive. Now, they were trapped because they could not return to the roof of the house where the mutants were waiting for them. The only way to escape was to break the bars and get inside through someone's apartment. But it wasn't so easy to do because there were a lot of mutants inside. One of them almost bit the man's hand, but he managed to push him away. Other monsters started to descend towards them. It was necessary to escape and do it as quickly as possible. Therefore, the men started to descend lower while the zombies were chasing them. There were so many of them that the men took a desperate step. In order to escape, they wanted to get to the neighboring house. Fortunately, they managed to do it at the last moment. A few more seconds and they would have died. I started screaming. He hoped that Feng Yun would hear him. She heard a familiar voice and couldn't believe that it was her savior. Feng Yun went out onto the balcony and saw her husband not far from her. Tears appeared on her face. He was alive. Emotions overwhelmed both of them, so he also burst into tears. Finally, for the first time in a long time of separation, he managed to see his own family. He tried to calm his wife. After all, he was able to return safe and sound, as he had promised. His daughter missed him very much and was happy when she finally could see him. She was also very happy when she saw his childhood friends next to him. The men intended to take his family and transfer them to a safe place where everyone who managed to survive would live. In addition, his friends were ready to take risks for him because the main character was their savior. However, Ji remained very modest. Suddenly, they saw zombies. The mutants were able to get to them, and now all people were in real danger. Jai quickly led his family inside the house, and he, along with the others, remained on the balcony and began to fight back. Strike! The first monster was destroyed. Another one came after him, also very strong. The man smashed his face with a sharp knife. This was not enough. They could not cope with the large number of mutants. The zombies were able to jump over their house and started to get inside. Now there were a lot of them. At this rate, they will not last, because the grate will not withstand such pressure. The only way to escape is to get out of the apartment through the back window. Meanwhile, the grate began to break and some zombies could get inside. Ji tried to stop them, however. All his efforts were in vain. The grate was broken, and now the zombies could get inside. However, his family had already started to descend from the window, so he needed to hold out for a while and try to stop the mutants. Only in this way could his family escape. For him, it was most important to save them. Jai could no longer hold them back. The bars were broken, so he started to run away. At the last moment, he managed to jump out the window and escape. Now he was on the ground, next to his family. The people continued to run and started to descend. After that, they reached a neighboring house to which a rope was stretched. The people did not know what would await them inside, however, they could no longer stay outside. Due to fear and stress, his carer began to cry. In order to calm her down, the man had to give her the last supplies of food that they had with them. The The man tried to explain that the mutants were bad and could eat them, so she needed to be with him and do everything as he said. Now that the child had calmed down, they could move on. Ahead was the tunnel they had come through. Finally, they breathed a sigh of relief because it seemed they were in a safe place. However, the workers who were there were behaving very strangely. It seemed that they were just sleeping because they did not react to people at all. Jai touched him because he wanted them to open the door. But very quickly he realized that all the workers were infected and turned into mutants. They began to attack people. He was very lucky because at the last moment the man managed to push the zombie away from him. A fight broke out and the men tried to kill all the infected. Feng Yun was defenseless. She had no weapons. She watched as the men, risking their own lives, tried to kill the monster with their own hands. At any cost, they wanted to protect her and the child and not let them die from the zombie bite. The fight was difficult because there were so many mutants. Feng Yun closed her daughter's eyes so that she wouldn't see the horror that was happening in the tunnel. When it was all over, the men wanted to take a breath. Now they were trapped. They didn't know if other people had been infected and what would await them on the surface. However, they had no other way. They simply couldn't turn back. The only way was the way forward, and they had to go back at any cost. The light in the tunnel suddenly disappeared, so people had to move almost blindly. The scary atmosphere became even more tense. He ordered one of his comrades to stay with his family. He, along with the others, were going to go ahead to scout. It was necessary to check if the tunnel was really safe. They started moving, but on their way they saw a lot of blood. All the walls of the tunnel and the floor were covered in blood, which meant that a fight had taken place here. In addition, they heard strange sounds. It was the growl of a zombie, which could not be confused with anything else. Going further, they saw a pile of dead people tearing apart human bodies. What they feared most had happened. Now, the group of people who had helped them were dead, and without them, they would not be able to get out of the tunnel and return. A battle began, where it was only them against a huge number of mutants. However, they did not retreat, but continued to stand and fight with them. For some time, they managed to fight back, but new zombies constantly came running. Still, the first group of mutants was destroyed. Ji raised his own flashlight. Now, they could continue moving forward. The men were covered in blood, scared and hungry, but they did not even intend to turn back. Ahead, they saw an exit. There was a ladder they could climb and get inside the house. The main character went first. Inside the room, he saw the bodies of other people. Behind him, his friend appeared. When they examined the bodies, it became clear what had really happened. These people were victims of mutants, and in addition, there were arrows in their bodies. When he was convinced that the room was really safe, he brought the others with him. The door in the room was closed on the other side, and this gave them hope that people could be alive. Jai tried to break it down, and after a while, he managed to do it. Suddenly, the sound of a shot. Jai covered his wife and daughter with his own body and ordered everyone to lie down on the ground. The shooting did not stop, and there were a lot of arrows on the walls. One of them got stuck in his briefcase. The man started screaming. He hoped that people would believe him and stop. A voice was heard from the other side, and after a while, someone looked in through the small window in the room. Suddenly, the door opened. Armed men appeared inside, ready to immediately shoot the entire group of the main character. After them, the chief entered, who was able to recognize Jie. But even after his appearance, the soldiers did not lower their weapons. In fact, it was a test to see if the people were infected. Only after that could they go inside. The first symptoms were supposed to appear in half an hour, so they just had to wait. The man also learned that the people had managed to kill all the zombies that were in the tunnel. With this act, they surpassed all his expectations, and then he realized that they were strong and brave warriors. As a sign of gratitude, he was going to treat them to food and drinks, so he invited the people to walk with him. However, Jai did not believe his words. He wanted them to just let go and refused food and any gifts. The old man was silent. He looked intently into the protagonist's face. And when his soldier started threatening people, he simply shut him up. It seemed that the old man understood that Ji was afraid and did not trust him. Nevertheless, he forced the people to go with him, and very soon, they were brought food and drinks. At any moment, he could simply give the order to kill them all, so the people simply had no choice. However, none of them ate anything except the guy in the blue suit. He was so hungry that he completely forgot about caution. Moreover, he was very surprised when no one except him even touched the food. Nowadays, people risked their lives for such food, so at this time, rice rolls became a real delicacy. However, the man did not take his words seriously, because he was convinced that it was just a move by the main character to gain respect for himself. However, the old man took his words as a threat and became very angry about it. They started arguing, so in order to calm them down, the main character intervened in the conversation. He was also curious why they were not being let go, and it only meant that they were needed. In fact, the old man wanted to ask them for a favor, Besides, he wanted to make a deal with them. Suddenly, everyone looked at him. As it turned out, the old man had lost touch with his own son, who lived in another district. That is why he wanted people to go looking for him. However, everyone knew that there were no people left in the area, because all the houses were occupied by mutants. Moreover, the man sent several units to rescue him, and none of them ever returned. Jai understood that his son was dead because a lot of time had passed since the day they introduced quarantine. But it didn't bother him at all, because he would never change his own decision or change his mind. Jun tried to explain that they were not experienced fighters, and besides, there were too few of them for such a journey. But the main character stopped him. He had conditions, and if the old man agreed, then he would go in search of his son. The old man became curious and decided to listen to him. For the return of his son, Ji wanted to receive 1,000 kilograms of grain. But when the man heard his words, he fell silent. Still, he agreed. But there was another condition that the man was going to voice. Jai wanted his wife and daughter to be taken to a safe place, to his parents. After that, he would calm down. But after his words, the head just laughed. He dropped a glass of water on the ground. They broke, and that was a sign. After that, people began to be tied up and tried to be taken prisoner. Hai had no choice but to try to resist. He started fighting and managed to injure one of the attackers. After that, another blow. Even several strong workers could not calm him down. However, when the gun was pointed at his wife, he stopped. Jai understood that she would be shot immediately, so he simply had no other choice. His daughter was crying, but Ji could do nothing to stop this horror. He simply gave up and waited for the enemies to tie him up. The cunning old man mocked them and was happy that the people were helpless. The old man thought that Ji wanted to trick him and was actually just looking for a way to escape. When he laughed, the main character's eyes filled with blood. His wife and daughter remained in the camp while they were sent on a mission at gunpoint. He really didn't want to part with her again. Feng Yun was crying. She was afraid again for her husband's life. Kair wanted to comfort her. She believed that her father was a superhero and could save them again. The old man tried to explain that he was not evil. He wanted to help them, but most of all, he wanted to try to find his own son. After these words, the woman could not stand it. She did not want to say this before, but now she could not help herself. She started to shout at him because he had done a very mean thing. The old man had grabbed them at the very moment when they needed help. But the soldiers covered her mouth so that she would not shout anymore and call the old man names. The man was convinced that he was doing the right thing. In his opinion, any person should first of all think only of himself, just as he thought of his own son. Suddenly, he turned to the man and woman who were standing next to him. He ordered his prisoners to be lowered down and handled as carefully as possible. They could not be tortured, and he ordered them to be fed well and given plenty of drinking water. Deep in his heart, he hoped that the men would be able to bring his son back. Meanwhile, the men continued to make their way through the streets of the city, which were swarming with zombies. They had to jump from house to house because walking along the streets was very dangerous because they were simply swarming with mutants. Their journey was very dangerous, so they helped and watched each other. One of them had an idea. He wanted to try to take the old man's daughter prisoner and try to free the main character's family. However, Ji was convinced that it would not work so easily because his daughter was not as important to him as his own son. Suddenly, she appeared right behind them. She went in search of her own brother. She managed to overhear the men's conversation, and she knew that in fact her father loved his own son more than her. The men realized that this was a good chance. Right now I could kill them all and then strike back. However, the woman was convinced that it would not work because her father had very good security and many shampoos in different parts of the city. And right now they could observe secret agents who were hiding in neighboring houses or on the streets of the city. So if they dare to take such a desperate step and try to follow the old man, he will definitely be able to stop it. In fact, she didn't love him because he didn't appreciate her and wasn't proud of her and his cool son. She became his problem right after she was born. Her relationship with her father was very difficult, but she was willing to risk her own life for him. But in reality, she was doing it for her own brother, whom she loved very much despite the fact that he was his favorite. Instead of wasting time, it was better to think about the next plan. She took out a map where there was a green dot, which was a place where they could stop because it was very safe there. It became clear that they had to cover a long distance, so it was a very dangerous operation. There were a lot of big houses in that area. The streets were wide. Also, a public park was opened, where there would most likely be a lot of mutants. Another area was marked on the map, which had a lot of tall houses. Also, there was the center of the old city. The scariest place they could find themselves, there was a large square that was filled with mutants. Also, there was a yellow line on the map, which was the metro route. However, the woman said that it was not completed and the construction had not been completed in time. In any case, they needed to pass by the city center. Therefore, they needed to try to build a plan. There was very little time left, so they kept moving. I didn't watch the huge number of people who managed to survive who were hiding in their own homes without food and water, but they couldn't help any of them. Every time I had to pass by people who were dying. One of the women, who hadn't left her apartment for several months, asked for some food and water. The girl stopped. She felt sorry for the old woman, so she gave her some food supplies. The old woman was very happy. However, the main character stopped her. He knew that the old woman was a cannibal, so there was no need to waste time on her. At that very moment, she took out a knife. She tried to attack the girl with it. At the last moment, she managed to jump back and avoid the attack. In fact, it was a trap that many people fell into. Now the real danger threatens them, because armed people began to attack them. One of the guards who was walking with them was wounded. She managed to wound one of the attackers, but the fight was not over yet. The door to the apartment opened and armed men started running from there, straight at them. There were a lot of them, and they were moving straight at the main characters. Also, an armed group of people started running from the other side. Now they were surrounded and had serious problems. She had no other choice, so she tried to blackmail and promised to blow up the building with her. This made the men stop, because none of them wanted to die. Jai held one of them at gunpoint, but he was afraid that the woman could really blow up the house, so he didn't want to take any chances and stopped. Suddenly, a strange scream came from the middle of the house. The same woman who had started it all came out. The old woman was very weak, but when all the soldiers saw her, they were scared. It seemed that they were all afraid, because she was the leader. Just at that moment, a woman from her group of people lost her husband and could not bear it anymore. She was very sorry, so she decided to let him try a rice ball, at least before he died. In fact, this food was very delicious, and he thanked her for this gift. But now he died. People started crying because he was a very good soldier. The old woman also cried a lot and started to regret trying to attack those armed men. But when the others smelled the rice ball, they realized that it was very delicious. He remembered the day when she first tasted human flesh. Right then, the old woman gathered them all in her own kitchen and decided to feed them. None of the people expected to see a soup that had so much meat in it. Moreover, it was very delicious. But many people wondered where she could get so much meat and cook so much food. Furthermore, none of them had seen any animals or other products. This question haunted them. Where had they been able to find the meat? But she did not answer. The woman simply stood up and left the table, but everyone saw her bandaged and cut leg. At that moment, everything became clear. What had really happened to her leg? People wanted to hear an explanation from her. But, in reality, she had cut off a piece of her own leg just so they could eat. None of them could understand why she had done it, and people wanted to thank her for the kindness she had done for them. They cried, but the woman assured them that she was fine. She had done it because she was old and could die at any moment. All the people were very young, and she hoped that this would benefit him. The boy who cried was her favorite, and she remembered that he was a very good boy in his childhood. Now the boy who was her favorite died. Now his dead body could become food, which the other people had to share among themselves. When they had food, the old woman let them go, because she didn't want other people to die too. Many of the soldiers couldn't understand her behavior and didn't know why they just let the people go. But the woman was convinced that they weren't murderers and were doing everything for their own survival. Now in front of the group of people was an area with large and tall buildings. The streets were indeed very wide, as they saw on the map, so there were a lot of dead people there. Now, the main character needed to collect all the necessary equipment. They wanted to move to the neighboring house, but they were separated by a wide street. He prepared very well, so he had a special machine that he wanted to throw a rope to another house. It was a gun that he managed to collect from all the objects that were under the rocks. He shot, but the first time he didn't succeed, because the range of the shot was too short. Jai tried again, but this time nothing. Every time he didn't succeed and had to do everything from the beginning. People had already lost hope of overcoming the wide street and wanted to turn back. However, they had another plan, because through binoculars they saw a tree that was very tall and grew exactly where the gun could reach. The rope they had might have been enough. But in order to get to the tree, it was necessary to go down to the square. Despite the danger, Jai began to go down. When he was on the ground, all the mutants that were around him started to run. The main character started to run because there were too many monsters and he would not be able to cope with them all. People who were on the roof began to protect him and tried to shoot the mutants who were chasing him. They threw Molotov cocktails at them and burned them. Also, imitated shooting from bows and learning to aim accurately. This allowed the main character to gain an advantage, and he gradually approached his goal. Now he was very close to the red car and the tree. Jai accelerated and jumped onto the car. Then he grabbed a branch of the tree and tried to climb it. When he was on the tree, he tried to pull the rope that people were holding onto at the other end. From the tree, he managed to reach the neighboring house, which is what he was trying to do. Nevertheless, he succeeded, and very quickly he was on the neighboring house. Now he needed to pull the rope so that other people could reach him and continue their journey. He was so preoccupied that he didn't notice a mutant appearing behind him and starting to chase him. In order to prevent him from biting himself, the man threw the book over his head and threw himself. People couldn't help him because the distance was too great and their arrows simply didn't reach him. So now he found himself alone against a strong mutant who wanted to eat him. The giant monster was right in front of him. The main character prepared to fight him. But the hero realized that the mutant was on the glass, so he could cheat. And he did it. And in order not to risk his own life, he simply destroyed the glass under him. However, the mutant managed to grab the edge of the metal support with his own paw. The man simply chopped off his fingers. Now, it seemed, the danger had passed because the mutant was on the ground. The height was not very great, so the monster was on the ground and remained alive. The zombie did not want to give up so easily, so he got to his feet and tried to tackle him again. He tried to jump up and grab the metal support again to try to reach the man. From the first time, he failed and people watched as the zombies tried to reach him. The hand of this guy there was very strong and he seemed to speak. Realizing that sooner or later I would be able to reach him, the main character had to run away. He tried to climb higher. The man did it as quickly as possible in order to break away from the pursuit. However, the zombie was smart and tried to climb the metal support again. To do this, he climbed the same tree, and from it, he could successfully reach the ledge on the house. The monster was moving very quickly, and soon I would be able to catch up with the man. In order to stop him, people tried to hit him with arrows. But it was very dangerous because at the same time they could advise the main character. Still, the zombie managed to catch up with him and grab the man by the leg. At that moment, he thought that this was his end because he definitely would not be able to cope with such a strong mutant. He was just very lucky because the woman actually saved his life. She hit him right in the arm with her own arrow, which stopped him. This really angered the monster. He saw him being shot at from a neighboring house. At that moment, they aimed at him again. Suddenly, a shot. The arrow hit him right in the back, and hit him right in the back. Meanwhile, the main character managed to get to the roof of the house. He breathed a sigh of relief because he managed to stay alive and complete a dangerous task. Suddenly, he saw that despite the huge number of arrows, Monster remained alive and would continue to pursue him all the time. But the man was not confused. He was ready for this. He aimed and shot him right in the forehead. Despite the fact that the poster was very deadly and the arrow hit him right in the eye, the mutant remained alive. He simply took it out of his own skull and wanted to tear the main character into small pieces. Suddenly, a new shot. This arrow went right through. But even that didn't stop him, and he also continued to stay alive. The main character had no other choice, so he tried to chop it with his own axe. Then when he wanted to hit it, the zombie caught his hand and stopped the blow. Now when they started to fall to the ground, but he managed to push the monster away from him. He got back on his feet and tried to attack the main character. G realized that defeating him was not so easy, so he chose a different tactic. To do this, he moved very quickly and did not let the zombies surround him. Because of this, he managed to tie up the monster. But that wasn't the end. In order to restrain the strong mutant, much more rope was needed, so he continued to tie him up. Finally, he managed to tie him up tightly, and he hoped that it might work. The others noticed that the main thing in the game was to defeat the strong mutant. And while the creatures couldn't get out, they had to push the rope as quickly as possible to get to him. Despite the fact that there were a lot of mutants below and the rope was very low above them, they had to move forward. One by one, people started to do it. After a while, they all ended up on the neighboring house. Now, they could all carefully examine the immortal monster that was trying to attack the main character. You wanted to kill him. This mutant was really very dangerous and strong. Besides, he was intelligent. If all zombies became like this, people would die without a single chance of salvation. However, one could not lose hope in such difficult situations, and one had to seek salvation at any cost. The guard, who was a veterinarian in the past, wanted to check the monster's internal organs. He managed to find the location of his heart and wanted to check if he would die after that. Well, with all his strength, he stabbed him with a knife right in the heart. The man realized that it was in place because blood began to flow from the heart and wound. Then, he continued to strike at other internal organs, trying to find its weak spot. Everyone watched what was happening. But it was obvious that the monster was much stronger than ordinary zombies, and even with internal organ damage, it did not die. In order to kill it, it was necessary to cut off its head or injure its brain. They did not have much time left, so they had to keep moving. As before, they tried not to go down to the streets and climbed from house to house with the help of a rope. In front of them, there was a large area, so they had to move along a pedestrian bridge. Thus, they also managed to overcome this difficult test. Next, they found themselves on a tall building, which they had to pass through because they couldn't reach its roof. In order to get inside, they had to unbend the protective grills, which we will use to cover almost all the windows. When everything was ready, the people were inside. They moved very carefully around the house, checking every room. It would get dark very soon, so they needed to find a safe place for themselves. This place could be their apartment, so they lit a fire and were going to spend the night there. The conversation turned to the old man and the fact that he had a lot of food and no one had ever robbed him. This information was not secret, so the girl agreed to tell her husband everything. After the epidemic began, her father united all the people in the house and did everything possible to make them work together. They were constantly engaged in buying underground tunnels and sometimes fought with other neighboring houses, which had the same united groups of people. They did not fight for the factory, which had huge reserves of metals and other food, and all the wealth belonged to her father. He managed to create a special food group, which included people who had families. They lived in a warehouse that was isolated from the outside world. In addition, her father had planted explosives in the warehouse and was ready to blow it up at any moment. He had a lot of power and paid all the people with food for their work, and those who did not work did not receive anything. Everyone at the factory knew very well about his methods of government and everyone agreed with it, so even small children worked. There was no guarantee that somewhere in the world there was a person exactly like her father, so people always remained suspicious and did not want to betray him. Everyone listened to her story very carefully and tried to understand who her father really was. While people were talking, it became very dark on the street. They all slept in turns, and there were always a few people left on duty. Now, it was the turn of the security guard who worked in the warehouse. He carefully watched the woman sleep. Gradually, when he began to approach her while she was sleeping, he wanted to grab her and strangle her. But in reality, she heard him and followed his every step, was not ready for this, and hid the knife. At the last moment, they managed to stop him and put the knife to her neck. In fact, the security guard was very worried about her and secretly loved her. He went on a dangerous journey only so that in the future she would become his wife. But she agreed to marry him only after they could save her brother. But this was not enough for him, and he wanted to at least try to kiss her. Still, she did not agree and pushed him away. The night passed. The turn of people was over. Now, they gathered all the necessary things that remained in the house and continued to move on in search of the lost boy. On their way, there were a huge number of no dances, which they constantly had to fight. Now they managed to go down to the basement, where the abandoned car was. People checked it, and after making sure that it was safe there, they decided to use it. We started loading the car with all our things and tried to seal the windows so that the mutant could not get inside. Now that the car was protected, they could not try to start the engine. That wasn't all. Just in case, the man doused her with gasoline so that in case of something, they could set the car on fire. Now, all the people got inside the car and the main character got behind the wheel. Jai was the only one who had to beat zombies in a car, so all the people trusted him. Now he started the engine and started moving. Very soon, he managed to break the garage gate and find himself right on the street. There were a lot of mutants there, and he started to crush them and was not afraid that the car would not hold up or get stuck. But with every minute, the mutants became more and more numerous. Therefore, he ordered his comrade to set the car on fire. Now they were hiding in the car, which was burning, and the monsters were afraid of fire, so they did not approach them. In order to stop the fire in the cabin, they used water, which they tried to stop the fire and it spread. But they very quickly realized that in fact not all zombies were afraid of flames. In addition, it was getting very hot in the car and there was a lot of smoke, so it was becoming very difficult to breathe. The whole car was on fire, even the tires started to burn. People were driving to the park and now that they were in place, they had to urgently leave the car. But when they got out of it and started running, the car exploded because the fire reached the tank. They were very lucky because if it had been a few more seconds, they would all have died. On the map, they noticed that there was a huge lake in the park with a lot of boats in it. It seemed to people that this was a very safe place because there were the fewest mutants in the water and they did not go into it. Therefore, each of them took a felt for himself and began to influence from the shore. This was the only place where people could relax and feel safe. On their way, there was a bridge on which there were a lot of mutants. And in order for them not to jump on them, they had to shoot them. In addition, the dead on your street jumped straight into the boat to them. However, people managed to overcome this threat. She remembered how long ago he had rested in this beautiful city with his family. He and his girls really loved this place. There were always a lot of people here, and it was very beautiful. G missed the times when he and his family could just rest and live. They fed the fish from the boat and laughed. He loved his family and wanted to spend a lot of time with them. However, now, he wanted to go back to those beautiful times again. He watched the fish in the lake swimming near their boat. And now, for him, it was food that was needed for survival. People were very happy because they understood that now we could not eat normal food, and fish on the tables for them was a real salvation. But there was no time for this because soon they needed to get to the shore, on which there were a lot of mutants. First of all, when I tried to clear a passage for myself in order to safely get to land and continue moving. But when they went ashore, they did not even suspect what danger awaited them. At first, everything was very calm and they did not hear anything suspicious. In order to conquer their way, they decided to walk through dense thickets. However, people could not even think that there would be a huge danger waiting for them. Immediately, a huge number of mutants rushed at them. A real bloodbath began, and none of them expected that there would be so many zombies. They began to surround people and attack from all sides. One of them even managed to bite the girl's hand. Now she realized that her path ended there, because immediately incomprehensible things began to happen to her body. At one point, another mutant wanted to bite her hand, but at the last moment, he was shot right in the face, which is why the girl was saved. In order for the infection not to spread throughout the body, it was necessary to take a desperate step. Therefore, she cut off her own hand and tried to stop the bleeding, while other people covered it with their own bodies. But the pain was so strong that she began to lose consciousness. She simply fell to the ground and could not continue fighting, so people had to try to protect her. The guard took her on his shoulder because they could not just leave her there to die. Besides, there was still hope that she would survive. People had to run. There were so many mutants that they would never be able to cope with them. The main character stopped so that people could get to the nearest building. Now it was his turn. He started running, catching up with them. The monsters continued to chase him. G was in heavy equipment and spent a lot of strength, so we started to help. The zombies approaching him grabbed his clothes and legs, so he dragged him down. After the main character tried to stop them and save them, people began to run away from them. Nevertheless, people managed to get to the mountain and everyone remained safe and sound. In addition, the girl came to her senses and remained healthy and unharmed, although her hand hurt very much. There were so many mutants that we did not build a living pyramid from each other and could reach people. Therefore, in order to stop them, the man had to use dynamite. There was a strong explosion and all the mutants who were nearby died. In addition, part of the building was destroyed and the people were only miraculously not under the rubble. But even though they had to stop the monsters for a while, others continued to arrive and would soon be able to climb up to them. Therefore, despite this, people continued to run away from them and tried to find a new safe place for themselves. This place was to be the neighboring house, so they began to climb the mountain. However, the zombies continued to pursue them. The girl understood that she had become a burden to people, so she wanted them to just leave her and not drag her along. But the guard, whom she had promised to marry, continued to save her no matter what. He really loved her and could not leave her just like that. He knew that she considered him a freak and that she did not like him. The main character tried to hurry him up and do everything to make him move faster and not betray him. But until he returns his daughter and wife, none of them will die. Now they managed to reach the surface. This place was relatively safe because they could kill all the mutants who tried to get to them. However, there were so many of them that they could not hold them back for so long. People were lucky because there was a television tower on the house and they tried to use it as a bridge to another house. But throwing her to the ground might not be as easy as it seemed at first glance, because she was securely attached to the ground and weighed several hundred kilograms. Jai asked people to hurry up because he wouldn't be able to hold out that long. Nevertheless, Faye managed to shake the tower and eventually the ground under it began to crack. To do this, he climbed to the 7th top so the tower began to fall with him. The man risked his own life so that they could have a chance to escape. But he was very lucky because he stayed alive. Now, they had a chance to get to the neighboring house and be safe. The mutants continued to pursue them as before. When many of them began to move towards them along the antenna, the men tried to throw it to the ground. However, it was so heavy that they couldn't do anything, and the mutants were getting closer and closer. One of them even managed to touch the main character's face. He was about to bite him, but at that moment, the antenna fell and all the mutants on it flew to the bottom. Now, they were safe, and it was possible to take care of the wounded and injured. Faye was very tired. He missed a peaceful and calm life where he could just rest. His friend decided to support him so that the man would not give up and keep moving forward. The girl could never have thought that the man who saved her could be so attentive to her. He did not leave her side and constantly made sure that she drank water, took medicine, and felt good. But he was a doctor by profession, so it was his job that he loved very much. Nevertheless, she finally realized that the man really loved her and was ready to die for her life, so she agreed to marry him after they returned home alive. Hearing this, he burst into tears. He was sure that they would return home and was ready to do everything possible for this. However, Jay understood that they had to leave. It was impossible to stay in such a dangerous place. Suddenly, one of them refused to leave. He wanted to stay. None of the people understood what was happening and why he decided to stay. However, in reality, he could no longer be saved. The man was doomed. His hand turned blue and a deadly infection began to spread throughout his body. He wanted his family to be told that he had simply fallen from a height and not turned into a mutant. Therefore, when people went to the neighboring house, he stayed in the same place. He looked at the photo of his family for the last time. It was their best photo together from the warm and sunny sea. Suddenly, the transformation began. The man began to vomit and bleed. After that, he fell to the ground. And then he finally began to change, becoming a mutant. Now he became one of the mutants who attacked people and were real killers. Finally, the people managed to come to the park, which was teeming with mutants, and there were no tall buildings nearby. Now the men truly understood how important and complex the operation they were about to perform was. The main character was so busy that he had no words, and all the time he was just silent. But before moving on, the men decided to have breakfast and regain their strength. They were in a dangerous place, so they decided to cook the fish they had caught the day before in the lake. Jai was so worried that he couldn't even eat. He refused the food that was offered to him, but he understood that he needed to regain his strength and energy. But instead of eating it himself, he gave his piece to the wounded woman who was sitting aside and watching them. The people were near a department store from which you could get into an underground cave because the shopping center and the dungeon were connected. Going around the square through the underground streets was a very good idea, but there could be many doors inside that were closed, so it would be a big problem to get inside the department store and get from it to the dungeon. However, they simply had no other choice. They could not go around the store through the streets because there were so many mutants there. Without wasting time, the men started moving and the main character was descending on the rope. While the others were holding him, Komi tried to break the glass in order to be able to get inside the store. He was very nervous because he did not know what dangers the store would hide inside. Also, he needed to cut the metal grill that protected him. After that, they were finally able to get inside and were ready for anything. On their way, they found a red door that could lead them to a storage room with supplies, food, and water. Now they had to try to break the lock. The main character succeeded, and now he found himself in a dark and cold room. Inside, there were tables with a lot of cutlery on them. Finally, they realized that they had come to a department where kitchen items were sold. However, they moved on and reached a place where clothes and many other valuable things were sold. However, this was not at all what they were looking for, and so people continued to move on. Finally, they managed to get to a place where there were really valuable things. Many axes, ropes, climbing equipment, and much more. She began to choose, and the first thing that caught his eye was a sharp axe. It was very comfortable and looked sturdy. In addition, it was very expensive and cost a whole $1,000. However, there was nothing else of value in the store. His friends were still unable to pick up anything for themselves. Meanwhile, the woman continued to look at the objects. Her attention was drawn to the mannequin, namely, his plastic hand, which she could use as a prosthesis for herself. Now, the people had a new difficult task. They had to go down, but the escalators were not working. G went first. As a leader, he carefully examined and listened to every rustle. Suddenly, they got into a special section for him. He saw a ring. Suddenly, he remembered events from the past when he and his wife were preparing for the wedding. The ring on his beloved's hand was incredibly beautiful and suited her very well. He remembered how he had promised to buy his wife a much better ring with a large diamond. Then she burst into tears because his goals seemed somehow illusory. However, now he had this opportunity, but he refused such a temptation and put the ring back in place. After all, he was convinced that a real gentleman should achieve his goals independently. However, Jun thought differently. He decided to take the ring with him. The diamond that was there was very strong, and this could help in a critical situation because it could cut glass. After that, they continued to move further through the house. Ahead was the main character, who illuminated the path for everyone else with his own lantern. Ahead, they saw a human corpse, which was still fresh after all had not begun to decompose. This meant that they were not the first people to be inside the store. They had to be careful, because danger lurked around. Suddenly, he stood in a pool of blood. In addition, it was accompanied by a terrible smell. Jun was very familiar. It was the smell of rotting flesh. It could have been spoiled food because zombies did not smell so terrible. Indeed, after a long corridor, the team found themselves in the grocery department, where there was a lot of food and alcohol. Inside the refrigerators were many bottles of wine and champagne. Surprisingly, they were not robbed by looters. In addition, there was a bag full of food lying on the ground, but no one took it. In addition, there was a lot of blood, which was fresh. It became clear that something was wrong with this place, so people decided to leave quickly. But as soon as they were about to turn back, they realized that it was too late. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a terrible scream. It was the voice of hungry craftsmen who began to surround them and were about to attack. In addition, they realized that there were a lot of mutants and they were not ordinary zombies. Right in front of them was a huge fence that separated them from another room in the store. People began to approach it because turning back was very risky and would take a lot of time. They needed to try to open the metal fence opposite. This would give them the opportunity to move on and shorten the path. But as soon as they began to approach, the terrible scream became louder and more distinct. It seemed that they were cannibals, but there was a lot of food in this city and there was no need to eat other people. Nevertheless, people got ready and turned off the lights. They set up a real ambush and waited for the enemies to come out on them. Now they had a clear plan, and none of them wanted to take any risks, because they did not know what threat awaited them ahead and what the secret of the dark shop would hide. The sounds were getting louder. G realized that the mutants were nearby, and suddenly he saw one of them. He was right behind the fence, where they needed to go. At that very moment, he prepared to attack, and as soon as Monster appeared in front of him, he shot him right in the head, trying to kill him. But it did not help. The mutant did not die, but became even more angry. In addition, other zombies appeared, who ran at the sounds of the shot. Another shot right in the head, even this did not help kill the strong mutant. The battle continued and other people also opened fire. However, even after that, the mutants did not die. Even shots to the head did not help. It became clear, zombies evolved. They became invulnerable to human attacks. The only way to win is to cut off their heads. The men began to flee, because soon, the fence would break. However, there was another way to fight them, and that was what they wanted to check. For this, a lot of alcohol was needed, but fortunately, there was a lot of it on the shelves of the store. After that, when the man found the right amount of alcohol, he started pouring it on the floor. Next, he used paper so that the mixture could be set on fire, and it burned well. Now, he needed to mix the alcohol content and use the paper to set the bottle on fire. He got a Molotov cocktail. Now, they were in a long maze of boxes and crates and did not know from which side the zombies would attack them. But the metal mesh was right in front of them, and G was waiting for the mutants to break it and start attacking. After some time, he heard a characteristic sound. The gate opened. Now, a huge army of mutants was looking for them and was ready to attack and tear people apart in a matter of minutes. These mutants were not like the others. They could think, so they began to look for people. To do this, they looked for traces and tried to catch the characteristic smell of human flesh. Jai understood that they would soon be found, so he could not delay, and he himself went out to meet the mutants. And when the zombies saw him, they began to run straight at the people. But the men were ready for this. They set fire to the cocktail and threw them directly into the crowd. There was an explosion, and a strong fire broke out. As a result, the boxes and cardboard caught fire, and the mutants started burning. But that's not all. After the fire, in order to finish off the zombies, people opened fire. They had a basket. It was full of alcohol, and it was they who sent it into the crowd of the still living dead. Then, a shot. There was another explosion, which was much stronger than the previous one. Everything around caught fire, and very soon, the entire floor of the house was in flames. However, everything was not so simple, because many mutants did not die. Suddenly, one of them rushed at the main character and almost hit him. She managed to dodge at the last moment. Despite such damage, the monster remained alive and even attacked people. The men began to fight, but the main character understood that he needed to cut off his head, and that's exactly what he tried to do. Meanwhile, they managed to open the security door. It was the only chance to get out of the burning room. Therefore, without hesitation, the people went there. But even there were a lot of dangerous mutants, whom the door did not stop. This path was blocked, so they had to quickly turn back and close the door behind them. But suddenly, the noise disappeared. It became very quiet. People were scared, because what could this mean? Suddenly, a strong blow that cut through the heavy metal door. It was an axe. Now all the men tried to block the door together to prevent the mutants from breaking through and killing them all. The zombies continued to break the door, but it was securely locked. This gave the men some time, so they decided to turn back. But there was no way back either, because their clothes started to burn, and due to the strong fire, they simply could not pass. Another way out was the entrance to the underground shopping center. But the door there was also blocked, so people tried to open it. With joint efforts, they managed to do it, and finally, the passage opened. Now it was necessary to break the metal grate. After some time, everything was ready, and the people opened the way in a dark underground tunnel. They started to go down the stairs, but as soon as they started to go lower, they realized that everything was underwater. Now they were knee-deep in water, and their movement slowed down. The water began to collect because the sewage system in the store was not working. Suddenly, they felt strong jolts due to strange sounds. It was a door that could not stand it. The mutants managed to open it, so people had to move as quickly as possible. They started to run. At that time, the zombies were able to feel their ice and began to chase people. Now, the men had to shoot back at them. It was getting deeper and deeper ahead, so they had to use inflatable rings to keep from drowning. In fact, the deep water was their salvation. The zombies couldn't swim, so they stopped. But not for long. because after that, they started climbing the walls and caught up with them again. Moreover, they were moving much faster than people could swim. However, they simply had nowhere to run, because there was a dead end from which there was no way out. They had no other choice, so they had to dive into the water. The man held his breath, then dove in. When they were underwater, they realized that it was very dangerous to return to the surface, because there were already zombies waiting for them. They couldn't swim, so they didn't dive with them. People, holding their breath, tried to turn back and move in the opposite direction. Thus, they could at least slightly break away from them. In order not to suffocate, they inhaled air from inflatable balloons. This allowed them to stay underwater all the time. In addition, there were a lot of mutants under the water who fell into the water and could not swim. At the same time, there were many corpses of other people who once hoped to save themselves in the water, but got stuck. Now, they found themselves at the entrance to the dark corridor from which they came. Only now, when they had broken away enough from the zombies, could they breathe air. Very quickly, people began to climb the stairs. However, it was impossible to relax because the zombies might continue to chase them when they realized what had really happened. Now they were able to get to the fishing shop. It was a place that had a lot of nets and other equipment, and this was exactly what they needed. It didn't take a few minutes, and the mutants had already caught their scent. They started chasing people again. However, now the men could use the nets to grab them. Several zombies fell into the trap and got stuck, but others continued to run. They had to fight them.